Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. In today's webinar, Julia Sadusky, a licensed clinical psychologist, will offer education and practical strategies for ministry leaders about how to shape a healthy environment for conversations around sexuality in your church context. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the publicist at Ave Maria Press. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions can be sent to our presenter using the questions box on the GoToWebinar panel, and I'll read as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you tomorrow via email. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Julia Sadusky is a licensed clinical psychologist and the owner of Lux Counseling and Consulting. She also is an author, consultant, speaker, and adjunct professor. Sadusky has done extensive research in sexual development and specializes in trauma-informed care. She earned a bachelor's degree from Ave University and a master's degree and doctorate in clinical psychology from Regent University. She is an affiliate member of the American Psychological Association, and her practice is in Littleton, Colorado. Julia, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter.
Okay, great.
All right. Very good. I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Well, thank you to everybody joining live and all those who will be listening back later. Excited to share with you a little bit about just some of the work I've been doing and thinking through how to foster healthy environments in our churches, in Catholic families around sexuality more broadly. So a lot of my research, a lot of my clinical work historically has been at the intersection of sexual orientation and gender questions, especially with young people. But more recently, I've been thinking a little bit more broad about just how do we effectively minister in a world where young people are getting an education from about everywhere else when it comes to sexual ethics and not getting as much formation in our communities and in our families. And so this webinar will draw a little bit from some of the work I've been doing in a 2-book series that we'll mention at the end. Start talking to your kids about sex, a practical guide for Catholics, and talking with your teen about sex. But the first thing I want to do is just invite people listening to take a second and just ask yourself this question: how was my sex education? And if you were to use a word to describe what you experienced when it came to formation as a young person around sexuality, what would that word be? And when I give talks like this, a lot of times I hear words like this. I hear silence, I hear absent, I hear awkward. And I think that's worth acknowledging right at the start, that our own formation impacts how we do ministry around sexuality. So if my parents didn't ever talk with me about sexuality, then even thinking through how to shape a conversation in ministry is going to be a lot more challenging. And sometimes we don't expect that. I think we expect that if we're wanting to be good at having and fostering healthy conversations around sexuality, that will translate into doing it. In my work as a clinical psychologist, I've been very struck by the fact that we can have all the good intentions in the world to form young people in sexual ethics, to form them beyond that, and just how do I become a healthy young person when it comes to developing as a sexual being. And those intentions don't always translate. And so we want to talk about in this webinar, how do we do that better and differently in our faith communities? So the first thing we want to do is clarify the messages we want to send. So in our ministry context, so you may be, a pastor, you may be a deacon, you may be a youth minister listening, and the first question is like, what is the take-home message I want children and teens to have from our faith community about sexuality? Like when they think of sexuality, when we think of sexuality, do we want it to be just about sexual intercourse, for instance? Or are we talking about something a little bit more broad? Are we seeing our sexuality in the context of our relationship with God and relationship with others? Or is sexuality seen as something isolated to just me? It's my sexuality and it doesn't impact other people. So we want to clarify the messages we want to send. And I want to share with you this quote from Gaudium et Spes 24:3, because this was the quote that really formed me as a young person. And I think I've been struck by how orienting it is when we're thinking about the message we want to send children and teens in our faith communities about sexuality. John Paul II wrote this, and it says this: man cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of self. What I love about this quote in the context of sexuality and the messaging we can send is that it highlights that sexuality is not something that hinges on a certain vocational path. You're not, fully living your sexuality only in marriage or in the religious life. You're fully finding yourself, discovering yourself as a person, a whole person, in the context of making of myself a gift. This sets such a framework, right, for our whole foundation in our faith tradition on sexuality, sexual ethics, our values, our boundaries around sexuality. But it also tells us that I can be fully alive as a person who is a sexual being, no matter what my state in life, no matter what age I am. And I think this is an important kind of framing of our conversation today. So our starting point for young people, I think, when Catholic ministry is at its best, and even more broadly, for anybody listening who's Protestant, to be able to really say that, we're meant to be a gift, and our sexuality, our embodiment as sexed beings reflects that to ourselves and to others. So when it comes to actually doing ministry, I want to talk with you a little bit about how do we break the silence, because I mentioned to you already that many people, when we look back on our own sexuality and education in that area, we acknowledge that there was a lot of silence. Maybe we had one conversation, but I don't know about you, but I remember kind of distinct memories in a youth ministry context at the time that I was a young person, and just being aware that we might have a talk at one point about like pornography on a retreat, or, girls talk, guys talk. But as far as an integrated messaging around sexuality, that was not there for my own faith community growing up. And I think that's true for many of us. So how do we break the silence? I give you a little bit of scripting here. This is a lot of what I try to do in my work, is say, here's how we can have this conversation. So I'm going to read this to you now. I can imagine in youth ministry or in, children's ministry, at some point we could say something like this: I'm realizing that in many of our churches and families, we never really talk about sexuality, bodies, boundaries openly. That can be because, and you kind of fill in the general barriers, right? We weren't taught how to, we didn't know where to start, we have fears about that, it can be uncomfortable for some of us. And then you ask the question to young people, like, what does that teach us about sexuality? And usually people say things like, well, it's bad, or it's not okay to talk about, or it's kind of weird, or it's supposed to be hidden, it's only for certain things. And then you might say something like, it's actually really important for us to have sexuality related conversations, first in our families and in our communities, so you aren't left to handle such important pieces of life alone. I want to be intentional in our ministry environment that that's one where we can have candid conversations about this and support you in talking with your parents as well. So you notice in this that we're kind of highlighting the way the church family is supporting the domestic church, which is our own individual families. This is where it becomes really important to think of your role in ministry not as being the answer to everything, not as being the only source of formation, but connecting parents to the resourcing they need to be supported and scaffolded. So I think as you start to try to create an intentional space for conversations about sexuality, it's very key to let parents into what you're trying to do. Because I don't know about you, but if if I'm a parent and my teen come home from youth group, let's say, and they're like, yeah, so we were talking all about pornography and masturbation, I might have a reaction to that as a parent if I wasn't aware, especially if I have my own shame about having those conversations. It can feel really alarming, or maybe I feel protective of my kid. Like, what did you say to them about that? What messaging are you sending? Which makes sense. And so I give you this script to just say, how do we bridge the gap of communication with parents to tell them what we're doing and not doing ahead of time, to bring them into the conversation and make sure they know that your ministry context is intending to do this, that they can participate in that to the degree that they'd like to, and that you're there to help them. So saying something like, it's really important in our community to support parents as the primary educators of their kids. We're working on creating and opening lines of communication with the teens and want it to support the relationship you have with your teen. We want to make sure you have resourcing at your disposal to be as effective as you can be. So you could send this in an email, you could say this out loud to a group of parents at the start of confirmation, formation, but just acknowledging that part of what you're trying to help with in your role in ministry is the formation of young people who are developing in their sexuality. And I think too often we shy away from that in ministry. We kind of don't look at that, and that leads to a lot of breakdowns in the efficacy of what we can do. So the first thing that I want to highlight here is acknowledging bodily changes. Now, I'm not suggesting that people in ministry, your job is to teach kids all about puberty and sit them down and say, here's what's happening in your body. I put these up here, though, to show you how much is happening in young boys and young girls as they move through puberty. I mean, some things are very similar, right, between young boys and young girls. We see things like everybody's kind of getting taller. People are experiencing acne usually, body hair changes, sweating, body odor, all of these things. And then there's some sex-specific changes that are happening. And I highlight in white here the things that come up in ministry some of the time, things like mental health care and symptoms, recommending therapy, mentoring, comparison, body image. Those are the things that I hear about from young people a lot in ministry and in therapy. And I think we just want to acknowledge a lot is happening for these young people. And so if we're expecting that we're just going to act as if none of that is at play and not account for what we can shape, within creating a healthy environment to address some of these pieces in tandem with what's happening at home, we're missing an opportunity. So again, I'm not suggesting that you kind of go into all the details with teens about what's happening to their body, but you're knowing that's happening. You're acknowledging that that's a reality. And there are things we can set a boundary around or framework around that can create a healthier environment. A big thing that I want to hit on here is body comments. A lot of times as bodies start to change, young people are noticing that, and that's very normal. And I think a way that we can shape a ministry context in light of that is teaching some rules, some ground rules for how to engage around things like body comments. So I've done some work in eating disorders historically, and it's hard to really appreciate until you do that work, or you've lived with an eating disorder, just how significant body comments can be in shaping a person's sense of self as a person who is a sexual being, a developing person as they go through puberty, but also into adulthood, just how they live and experience their bodies. So saying something like this in a ministry context, it's a way to kind of get at that and create and foster a healthier conversation. Sometimes people will think it's funny to make jokes about someone's size or shape, especially as puberty hits and bodies start to change. It's normal for weight and size to change for all of us as we grow. In our community, we're going to work on not commenting on other people's bodies. It's really not helpful to focus on our body size or shape or other people's body size or shape, because those things don't have anything to do with our value. That's why we focus on people as a whole. I can comment on your bright smile, your vibrant laugh, but I'm not going to comment on your weight and size. And I don't want you to comment on those things in others. If somebody was to say something like that about your body, you could ignore them, tell them to stop, or say something simple like, please don't comment on my body. Sometimes people also comment on people's body parts, right? A girl's butt, a guy's penis, or other body parts. Even if they're saying something that seems complimentary, people aren't merely body parts. So it's not appropriate to talk about people merely as parts. If you hear a friend commenting in that way, what could you say? And you can have these conversations, even in a small group with young people, and get them talking. What could I say? What would I say? This teaches them something that is very integrating, right? If I'm a whole person, God cares about these moments in my life, and He wants to help me be my best advocate and be the advocate of other people in our community to shape a ministry space that is healthier. You give kids tips. A lot of times people are like, I don't know what I would say. Nobody's ever modeled that for me. And in our Christian communities, in our context, we can say, well, here's a couple of ideas. You can change the subject. You can redirect. And again, I'm not suggesting you have to do a whole night to address eating disorders, but we know young people especially are struggling more and more today with a healthy sense of who they are as embodied people. And we want to help that. But the church, part of our role is shaping a space, not so much where we're addressing that explicitly all the time, but we're setting enough of a framework where we're removing things as best we can and responding and redirecting habits that are going to be harmful to people's mental health, but also their spiritual health as they move forward. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is explicit conversation in our communities about sexual behaviors and intercourse. Certainly, I think for many of us, if we were kind of raised in Catholic families, there were conversations about intercourse at some point. Maybe it was a one-time conversation, maybe you heard adults talking about it, but we know something in our communities about talking about sexual intercourse. What's striking to me in recent years, and we've seen this probably in the last 2 decades, that the percentage of young people having sexual intercourse in particular is dropping all the time. Every trend for the last, I think it's 2 to 4 decades, has been a decline in young people engaging in sexual intercourse. Now, we could go into all the whys of that, but I think that's outside of the scope of our time. What I want to highlight here is that in 15 to 19-year-olds, about 40% have had sexual intercourse. If young people think people are having sexual intercourse, they are more likely to engage in sexual intercourse, which is very important in ministry to know that if we're not accounting for what is, honestly, we're actually making it more likely for young people to have sex. So what do I mean by that? It can happen sometimes in youth contexts that we can create a kind of us-them mentality about the world out there where everybody's lost and everybody's having sex and they're so lost. That type of messaging actually undermines what we're trying to do, which is reduce sexual behavior in young people. So telling them, and sometimes I'll ask teens this in therapy and in ministry context, what percentage of young people do you think are having sex? And usually when I ask that, the answer is like 70%, 80%. And when I tell them 40%, they're shocked. But it's good for them to know. And I want you as people in ministry to know that as well. About 40% of young people 15 to 19 haven't had sexual intercourse. By about 15, only about 20% have. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the end of our conversation. Oh, well, good, they're having less sex than ever before. That's all we have to say about that. It's important to recognize the most common reason young people abstain from sex is their religious beliefs. So the faith community actually has a part to play in helping young people know accurate information about sexual behavior to the extent that's appropriate in that context, and help them understand a framework for why sexual intercourse would not be value added to their life in adolescence. It will be something their friends are considering. It will be something they may consider, especially if they're in a romantic relationship. The other piece I want to comment on here is this, that a lot of times well-intentioned ministers make the focus of conversations about sexuality, sexual intercourse, and the not having of sex. That doesn't mean we're protecting young people from engaging in other sexual behaviors that can be complicated, that can expose them to sexually transmitted infections. It just means they're saying no to sex. if they're kind of taking in what is often taught in our context. What we want to do is also help young people understand what they're communicating in sexual behavior, what they're longing for in engaging in sexual behaviors, kissing, fondling, all of these things, and the contexts that are going to set them up for success in chastity. So often we talk with people about what not to do to be chaste, but we don't talk with them about what does it look like positively to be chaste in the world? What does it open you up to in your relationships? How do you structure a romantic relationship with somebody in high school where you're not going to be put in situations that become really challenging to navigate? So these are the types of things that we want to move towards more. I want to touch on another piece of this. You know how I mentioned that, so often we're focused on what you're not encouraging teens to do. Don't have sex, maybe don't date in high school. Sometimes parents and educators recommend that. Another area that I see a hole in some of the formation and some of the establishment of a real safe environment in our faith communities is how we are or aren't talking about unwanted sexual experiences and abuse. Certainly, we know in our communities there's a history of profound harm done to some young people at the hands of the manipulation of certain clergy members, religious priests, parents, that we sometimes assume in our communities that our community is safe and the world is a threat. And we're not, in doing so, preparing young people to be able to identify patterns that could be damaging to them in our communities and outside of them. So I'll give you an example. One young person that I have been walking with and mentoring has shared that, a lot of times she got the message like, okay, you're not having sex, good. You're not in a romantic relationship where you're engaging in, let's say oral sex, good. But then she didn't want to really know what to do when she was in a romantic relationship with somebody where they seemed to be kind of aggressive in how they were physical with her, and she didn't know what to do about that. And maybe some people listening can relate to this, that it's like, yeah, I knew how to, kind of wrap my mind around not having sex, but I didn't know what to do when somebody, an older person in my life who I was interested in, was moving towards me in a way that was inappropriate. This becomes really important if you're going on overnight trips and with your youth, to be able to prepare people for some of the ground rules for those types of environments, and again, in the community at large. So how do we talk about this? I mean, this is so sensitive, but I think there are ways to have the conversation that are sensitive, reverent, and also candid with young people. How might you say that in a ministry context? Sometimes a person may try to touch you in a way you don't want. Even if you like the person, that doesn't mean they're allowed to touch you in a way that makes you uncomfortable. What could you do if someone did that? Even if that someone was somebody you were dating or interested in, or somebody your family knew. You could say, stop. It's not rude to say no. This is critical because in our communities, sometimes young people interpret politeness as the goal. Like, I can't be rude, I can't say no because that's impolite as a Christian. So reminding them it's not rude to say no if somebody's treating you in a way that makes you uncomfortable. And not uncomfortable in like, oh, I don't like, that you're kind of like sitting, on the same couch as me, but you know what I mean. Exchanges, altercations where somebody invades your personal space or they touch you in a way that feels objectifying. If you find it difficult to say something in the moment, you can use your body to move away. This is really important to coach children and teens on in our faith communities, that sometimes we can't speak actually when we're in a situation that's really activating. So what do? We can use our body to literally move away. And then teaching them that, sometimes it's hard to speak or move. Situations like that are not your fault. Sometimes we freeze when we're uncomfortable. Have you ever noticed that? In those cases, you get out of the situation as quickly as you can and reach out to a trusted person, especially your parents. We will help you figure out what to do. And if you share about these types of experiences, we will help you get the support you're needing. So many young people move through our faith communities in all types of faith formation, experiencing unwanted sexual experiences, abuse and neglect, and they're not sharing it because they're not feeling like people in our communities are able to facilitate those conversations. It's much like what we know about suicide prevention in young people, that if we're not talking about suicide or self-harm because we're afraid of giving kids the ideas, all that means is that they're not going to come to us when those things arise. We want our faith communities to be spaces where if something inappropriate is happening, something that can really impact the development, the spiritual development of a young person, whether it's happening in our circles or outside of them, we want to be shaping and inviting our churches, our faith communities as spaces where these conversations can be had. The best way we can do that is initiating a conversation. And you'll be surprised, kids remember these types of conversations when they need to. Okay. Now I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk with you about a few other pieces that are just kind of common and necessary to be talking about with young people in ministry. Certainly masturbation, I'll call it self-stimulation is just kind of the word I use clinically, but what we know is by about age 15, nearly 100% of boys and 25% of girls will have self-stimulated to orgasm at least once. So how do you engage with that while being respectful of parents being the primary educators of their kids? I think there's a way to do it. And I think it's, again, highlighting for parents an effort to try to help point teens back to their parents, but also facilitating conversation. Ministry at its best is bridging gaps of communication with other sources of support like parents, and it's also creating spaces that are unique for kids to be able to talk with one another about these challenges. You might say something like, there are lots of different ways teens try to get to know their bodies when they're around your age or older. One way that's common is something called masturbation. What have you heard about this? So this protects you from overexposing people and just giving way more detail than necessary. You're asking them, what have you heard about this? And that's a good rule of thumb with anything sexuality related with young people, or a lot of things that we want to talk about with them. What have you heard? And then you're gauging what they've heard, and you're being careful about overexposing, but you're initiate a conversation that says, we can talk about that thing here. How do you talk about it then? This is another piece. We're going to define it, and this becomes really important. I've worked with a lot of Catholics who say things like this to me. In my community, we did talk about masturbation in my church. We talked about it. I was told it was a mortal sin. I was told not to engage in it. But one person said, as a young woman, I didn't even know that what I was doing was masturbating, because I thought that of it only in the kind of male context of how men self-stimulate. And so she didn't even realize for many years what she was engaging in was self-stimulation. When she realized it, the shame and the self-loathing and the sense that, oh my gosh, I've been committing mortal sins all this time and I haven't repented of it, just hit her with so much heaviness that she kept it in isolation for about 10 more years. And so we want to be able to just candidly, very medically, just define, here's what masturbation is. It's a type of stimulation, rubbing or touching of the genitals with an object or your hand in a way that causes arousal. Our genitals will feel pleasure if touched in certain ways. The feeling of pleasure is not in itself a bad thing. As Catholics, we also know that our genitals have a specific purpose, which is to be stimulated in the context of a relationship with a spouse where you are giving of yourself to the other and receiving them as a gift. You can address myths about pornography and masturbation in ministry contexts. Some people will say, and many people in my field of psychology will say, you need to self-stimulate to be healthy, that's how you learn about your body, that's how you reduce stress, that's how you put yourself to sleep at night. And actually, that's not the case. And there are ways to be confident and healthy and understanding your body without that. We want to set a framework for young people for what our pleasure within the sexual experience is actually for, that it's for unity with the spouse. Masturbation isn't a part of God's plan for our sexual lives. It's not necessary. There are different acts, all kinds of things that we can engage in that can lead to pleasure, but they're not God's best for us because they take the purpose of sex and move it outside of the context it's made for. And then we invite discussion, right? I mean, I was given a talk to young people recently, and a young person was just going back and forth with me, really wrestling with some of the church teachings on different pieces of sexuality. And it was so beautiful. And I just said to him, keep wrestling with God. It's such a compliment that you bring these hard questions to him. And so we're inviting discussion. We're saying to teens, if you hear other things from your friends or other people about this topic, we can help you get the support you need. We can help you wrestle with this. So you're inviting that, and you're directing young people to talk to their parents about these things. So now we want to move into a little bit of conversation about pornography. About half of 11 to 13-year-olds have seen porn at some point. That number increases to about 79% of 16 to 17-year-olds. A lot of times in our context, we either assume it's inevitable and there's nothing to be done about it, or we assume it won't happen to people in our context. What's really important to stress, especially if you're doing ministry with anybody between the ages of like 8 and 16, is this, that the first exposure and many subsequent exposures to pornography are usually accidental. That can be a lot of things. That can be because something popped up online. It can be a Google search gone awry. It can be opening up an older sibling or a cousin's phone and seeing something on there. It can be a friend sending a video without telling somebody what it is. It can be, a friend at a sleepover pulling something up on their phone. There's all kinds of ways that exposure happens. But when we frame pornography merely to young people, especially, as mortal sin, I just want you to think about that. I'm not saying that these things aren't sin. I'm not saying they're not disordered, but framing it purely as mortal sin puts it in a category of volition, intention, knowing something is grave and engaging it in any way. And that compounds shame about things that are accidental. And so we want to be clear when we talk about pornography and even self-stimulation with young people, to talk about categories of sin, yes, but to not label things as mortal sin when a person is, especially at a young age, accidentally being exposed to these things. So most teens, when we look at the research today, wish they could talk with a trusted adult about pornography, but two questions arise. One is, I don't know how to start the conversation. Number two is, I don't know who to talk to. This gets into everything, including confession, right? How do I know that a priest can receive me in this space? How do I know that they'll say something helpful to me and constructive in these spaces? And so our ministry context, we want to begin to really address, how do we help young people with something that is inundating them in a way that it hasn't before? And half of 11 to 13-year-olds is a pretty marked number. And that means that the church is meant to shape and help facilitate healthier conversations about pornography as well. One person I met with shared with me, this quote, and I want to share it with you in your ministry. He said, I don't remember a lot of deep conversations with my dad growing up, raised in a Catholic family, but I do remember him lecturing me after he would discover me watching porn. After a while, it was like a routine: watch porn, get caught, get a lecture, tell him I wouldn't do it again, and weeks later, find myself back in the cycle. I knew my dad wanted me to stop, and I did too. But he really didn't do much other than tell me what not to do. I don't honestly remember any conversations that helped me understand why I kept watching porn. I just felt like a monster. My church didn't talk about it, except in a guy struggle with this and we need to talk about it and support each other kind of way. That didn't help me know how to talk about it, but just that something was wrong with me for not talking about it. So you can hear in that, right, the shame, this sense of this bearing down of like, something's wrong with me, something wrong with me, without feeling like there's enough support and resourcing around us to help young people move in a different direction and be curious about what these behaviors are doing for them so that they can address them effectively. So I give you on this slide just a list of the different functions of masturbation and pornography, because I think this is really important. Young people especially are engaging these things more frequently than we've seen in any other previous generation, and the accessibility is so profound. There's so many ways to get access to pornography especially. And what we know is that all these things are not merely about sexual release of tension. They are also things that young people are using to wind the body down to sleep, distract from discomfort and pain, numb their emotions, amplify a positive mood state. I feel bad, I feel good, and I want to feel better longer. Um, Watching pornography, self-stimulating, can be a way to do that. Coping with difficult emotions, sadness, boredom, anger, disgust, shame, loneliness, inefficacy. I could go on. Releasing emotions, things like anger and aggression that don't feel safe to release otherwise. And then obviously release in response to sexual fantasy or porn and exploration of the body. And young people are being taught today that these are necessary, normal, and helpful ways to explore their body. What I can tell you is a lot of secular researchers are coming out with evidence in recent years that people who are watching pornography, especially because of the nature of it today, where it's much more violent than ever before, there's all kinds of trends of very violent, even things like strangulation with young people. And we're seeing that the young people who are viewing pornography are more likely to be aggressive sexually. They're more likely to experience depression and anxiety at markedly high rates. And they're more likely to isolate from others and experience great loneliness. And so we're seeing some of the impacts of these behaviors. But we want to hold in tension that, as that quote before said, that young person just felt like, I'm just a monster. And we want to thicken the plot for young people that, hey, these are the reasons people go to this. Maybe you've done that too, to wind down and put your body to sleep, to amplify a positive mood, to numb out, to distract, to cope with difficult emotions. And God knows you from the inside. God sees what you're navigating, and he wants to help you in our community with these things. But it doesn't help to think of yourself as a monster. It's good to be curious about what's happening, what's drawing me to this, and if I'm going to move away from behavior, what am I moving towards? What are the positive things that I can do to cope with difficult emotions if I'm not going to turn to these things? Instead of a simple conversation of don't do it, tell people about it, report back when you've messed up, that really doesn't help shape a more healthy, productive move towards virtue in this area. So we're going to, just like we did with self-stimulation, introduce and define what porn is and how it can show up. I'm going to talk with you about something called pornography. What have you heard about it? It's any type of image, video, or writing that shows the human body and sexual behaviors in a way that's meant to make the person watching have a sexual response. It can come up accidentally through a Google search, through a friend or peer showing us, or through an advertisement. Give language for what it can feel like. That's why I give you that previous slide. Acknowledging, yeah, it can feel exciting and interesting, and it can lead to shame and guilt and pain. Sexual intimacy is sacred. It's meant for the people sharing it and is not meant to be entertainment, even though it can feel pleasurable to watch. Helping young people know what to do when exposed to pornography is really important because it's so common. If you happen to see pornography or find yourself drawn to it, this is something we can help you talk about with your parents. For now, you can ask your parents to put filters up to reduce the likelihood of this happening. Acknowledge the impacts of porn and benefits of refraining from it, and follow up. Okay. I give you on this slide just a few applications that have been really helpful for families and filtering out content online. Devices are everywhere today, and our culture is really wrestling with to what extent do we bring these into our children's lives. But Bark Jr., Aura, and Covenant Eyes are three options that have been really helpful to families. So I want you to know them in ministry. If people are asking, what can we do to filter devices? Well, these are the things. And doing that proactively is always better than having to do it reactively to a disclosure or discovery of something. Okay. I want to talk for a minute before we open up a time of Q&A, so get your questions going in the chat as we do this. I want to talk a little bit about LGBT identifying youth and how to address in our faith context conversations about sexuality as it relates to sexual orientation and gender in particular ways. So about 1 in 5 young people today, if you look at the most recent study from the CDC, are identifying as LGBT. So I say that to you to just acknowledge where we are. I mean, in this time, we're not going to dive in. We could do a whole webinar on walking with LGBT identifying youth who are in our communities, but I just want to acknowledge that this is a significant number, a marked increase from what we've seen historically. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, that again, we could talk about at length. But I want to name that young people in our faith communities are navigating these experiences. They are going to be holding them. And a lot of times what I hear from, you know, children and teens is that it feels like I kind of got to keep these in different boxes. Like I've got this over here and then I've got my faith over here and the two shall never touch. And so I want to give you just a few pointers before we open up Q&A about how to navigate this in conversation in ministry context. The first is a distinction that I got from a colleague of mine, Bill Hunson, who runs an organization called Posture Shift. And he gave this language. He talks about how in our culture today, it's often framed that if you disagree with the dominant narrative about, let's say, gay marriage, that you are a bigot. And why is that? Well, in part, maybe it's making a mischaracterization of people of faith, but in part, it's because if we're honest, sometimes in our communities, we can be very harsh and sometimes even cruel towards people with LGBT experiences. And so what Bill says is this, is that we want to give language for our position, which includes our understanding of the human person, our understanding of scripture, of church tradition, all these things. And we want to be able to articulate a Catholic position on sexual ethics. That's really important in ministry. And good ministry that leaves that out is weakened in its effectiveness. We also want to articulate for young people a posture that I can hold a position, deeply held convictions on marriage, on family, on God's best for sexual ethics and what he teaches us and reveals to us through his church. And I can have a posture of respect and care and thoughtfulness and interest in people who have not been taught that position. This is where we want to give young people a framework where they can have beliefs about sexual ethics in keeping with a Catholic ethic and relate to people, all kinds of people, in ways that are respectful and caring and thoughtful and honest. We want to invite in our communities disclosure. Remember how I mentioned that many young people feel like they have to keep these areas separate. And I want to just say that, yeah, we want to actually help invite young people. The way we do this is by how we talk about people with LGBT experiences. The number one thing I hear from young people is that they're listening to how ministers talk about people like me. And so recognizing if there are comments made in your church community that are demeaning of the dignity of people who identify as LGBT, do I speak up about that? Do I say something like, hey, we don't talk about people that way here? You know, it's important that we can hold our sexual ethics and talk about people in a way that's humanizing. And then reducing shame. If somebody shares with you about their own exploration of sexuality, of gender, saying, you know, I'm so grateful, I'm so proud of you for sharing this with me. And I want you to know that God sees you, God loves you, and he also likes you, and he wants to draw near to you in this experience. He wants to walk with you in this. He has a plan, not a plan B, but a plan A for your life and your experience of sexuality. So I want to stop there, and I want to just open up a time for our Q&A.
All right. Thank you so much, Julia. I'll let you have a breath there. And I invite all of you on with us to submit your questions at this time. Lots to take in, lots to reflect on, certainly. And as the questions start coming, I thought I would just begin by asking you a question. So let me say that, you know, a parish or a ministry really wants to kind of change the way they talk about these sorts of topics with young people. What would be the way to start or to begin to make those steps, those changes?
Mhm. Yeah, I think the first thing is kind of a two-pronged approach. I think you want to bring in the primary educators, right? The parents. You want to notify them that this is an intention of ours. So at the start of a new academic year is a great time to do that. Like, hey, we're going to have a parent meeting and we're just going to kind of name that this is what we're intending to do. And in that time, I think it's easier to like get people live and to get them to tell you right then, write down on a piece of paper, what are 3 areas that you really feel like you could use our support in this? So you're getting the parents to articulate what they're needing and how you can support them in ministry, as opposed to number one, having to reinvent the wheel and kind of throw darts at the dark and see what sticks. But you're opening up a dialogue where it's a unified approach. And then I think with the young people especially, we want to do the same thing. It's like, hey, this is an intention of our community. We don't always do well in faith contexts and outside of them talking about sexuality. What are the areas that you would like to be able to talk about in youth group or in faith formation, and get them to 2 or 3 things again on a piece of paper? I think that's a really practical first step to just show intention and invite a bit of just kind of boots on the ground research and what are we really needing and how do we prioritize what comes up most.
Great, thank you. All right, we got some questions coming in. Let's see. How would you recommend navigating a moral relativist view to this topic?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think we have to acknowledge that that is the water that everybody is swimming in today. That's not just a thought experiment that we can engage with cognitively. When we talk about relativism, we're talking about the dominant way that people engage with reality today. Um, and so I actually like the idea of helping young people know that that's happening, and not in an antagonistic way. Like sometimes we use phrases with children and teens like relativism, and they don't even know what we're talking about.
Mhm.
And they don't even know that what we're talking about and what they're steeped in is relativism. So you can do some teaching on that, right? Like, hey, like there's this thing called relativism. It's this idea, right, that there's no absolute truth, that it's your truth and my truth. And I would say it's pretty dominant in our culture. How has that come up? How have you heard that? How do you even think about the world informed by that? And so you're helping build that reflection, um, and inviting them to pray, to bring that to God. What are the resources they might be interested in reading, or a podcast or something, or a short video clip at the end of a youth night to engage with this, but not in a way that makes a caricature of it. I think that's the biggest mistake I see us making with relativism, is we kind of frame that group of people as like foolish or stupid or illogical. And this is what the young people believe and what their closest friends are drawn to and would stake their life on right now. And so if we make a caricature, I think we lose credibility, and we can critically engage and be thoughtful without undercutting the kind of respectability of people drawn into that position.
Mhm. Okay. This is kind of a comment, but I think you can reflect on it. A parent might disagree with the church teaching and not support work that takes place in the parish ministry.
That's
How,
very
yes.
Yes, I was just given a talk last week, and it was very evident to me from the parents that many of them, right, were not in line with what the church teaches about a lot of things. I mean, we've seen the stats on the percentage of people who believe in the real presence in the Eucharist. We don't stop teaching about the real presence. In fact, we've leaned into that,
Mhm.
um, but we do so with an awareness, right, that we're not going to mock people, hopefully, for questioning. And I think it's the same thing here. You have to expect that many of the young people are not just raised by family members who disagree with church teaching, but oftentimes are living in a departure with it, so that when we talk about sexual ethics, we're talking about their uncle in some type of way. And I think being able to acknowledge that, name that, hold that intention, be respectful and reverent, and not apologize, right? Either, like, we're not going to say, so we're not going to teach. It's really holding it out with humility, that like, and I really do believe that God has given us something true here, and I want to share that with you and invite parents into that. Something I say to parents who disagree with church teaching is, can you give your young person a shot to receive this thing that, yeah, you've wrestled with differently, you've landed differently, but can you give them an opportunity to receive that thing, engage with it in your home in a way that allows them maybe to land where you are, and maybe actually to align with it differently than how you've chosen to.
Hmm. Here's a comment and a question. I think this was excellent. Thank you. How do we struggle with ministers, church leaders who think that they need to tell young people truth and not invite questions or dialogue?
Yeah, great
I was
question.
kind of thinking about this too, like as we evangelize, we don't hit them right away with, the main gospel message, right? We accompany them. We start
Mhm.
to befriend the relationships, but I'll let you answer.
Yeah, so it's become this really interesting extension of a larger polarization in our culture, right? Are you the truth people, or are you love people? Are you the mercy people, or are you the justice people? And um,
Mm,
I really try to stay away from those labels because I don't like the idea of somebody having a market on what is the Holy Spirit, which is truth, mercy, love, all, like, we could go on, right? And so I try to stay out of that type of labeling. But what I want to recognize is that there are going to be people whose most comfortable strategy, and I think that's the way I would frame it, is like it's the more comfortable strategy uh, to be more of a culture warrior. And there are also those of us who may find it more comfortable to be the cultural capitulator, where it's like people come and we're not going to say anything that would depart from the dominant cultural narrative because we don't want to upset people. And so in ministry, we can do one of those two things, maybe more predominantly. But if we want to help raise cultural ambassadors, people who are in the world and not of the world, people who are engaging critically with ideas that are a departure from Catholic teaching, and doing so in a way that actually is winsome and draws people to the truth, that's going to be more effective. And the analogy I use with people like the one, maybe the personality described in this question, is I give the analogy of like if a person comes to you and you're fresh out of seminary and they are wrestling with the problem of pain, and their mother just got diagnosed with cancer, and they want to know about the problem of evil and problem of pain. How is there, I don't even know if God exists anymore. Well, you've got all your like Aristotle and Aquinas, and you can pull out the 5 proofs of the existence of God. And some people who are new priests do that, right? And some new ministers where it's like, well, I've got the argument for you. And then we learn as we do ministry that giving people the right answer, even when it's true, doesn't actually form disciples. And we learn, like, yeah, if I'm honest, I'm probably not going to lead with the 5 proofs of the existence of God. Now, I may do that at some point, but it's like not the right time.
mhm,
And I would use that analogy, and I found that to be helpful with people in ministry who are pulling more for the truth and they're protecting something good. It's like, yep, I'm with you. I want to protect that too. How do we communicate that to an actual person who's a soul who's listening? And the strategy of talking at somebody, especially with teens, is like a really paradoxical move, because if you want them to get it, your best bet is to lead them in a walk where they're moving towards the good, the true, and the beautiful, not talking at them and trying to convince them. That's where they get much more adversarial.
mhm. Absolutely. All right. Well, as you were talking, I was also thinking about, I love how you have these talking points in your
Mhm.
books, right? Really giving us, or those who need it, the script to help to have these conversations, because the questioning and the engaging in the conversations is so important. Um, so you read some of those for us on these topics. Do you want to say anything else about these two books?
Yeah, I would just say that, these books are certainly primarily for parents, but they also, I'm getting feedback that single adults and, teachers, educators, everybody seems to be benefiting from just being able to kind of get the sex education we didn't get in a
Yes.
resource. and then find your own way to share it with others. So I give scripts, you mentioned that, not because I have the best way to say it, but I think having a starting point that you can kind of bounce off of and use and tweak is the hope of these books. So they're both available now, one for parents and trusted adults of kids 0 to 9, and the second, the teen book for parents and trusted adults of people 10 to 18.
Yes. Thank you so much for writing these. I think they are excellent resources and so needed in our church and in our communities. And I agree that they really do, not primarily just for parents. I feel I was a teacher for many years. I would have loved to have the teen sex book. So we invite you, always give you a little discount here, 25% off using code webinar 0507. Well, Julia, I really appreciate you spending time with us. Maybe we can encourage you to come back sometime and share some more strategies with us. Really, really thankful and very helpful. And thank you for all of you who have shared, this hour with us today. Also, we really appreciate your support of these webinars and all that you do in your ministry, especially. So I invite you to join us. May 28th will be our next webinar. Donna McLeod had been doing some webinars with us for a while on her bereavement program, Seasons of Hope. And so this is going to be the final one in that series, how we can help mentor those who minister to others. So join us in May. All right. Thank you again. Take care. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.